A refinery worker got a call from his broker. Get out now. He had $954,000 in there, 40 years of shift work. The money never came. And his own government had written it down 12 years earlier in its own files that this bank was probably a Ponzi scheme. $7 billion vanished anyway. Both of those things are in the public record. So how does that happen?
This story isn't really about the man who took his money. You'll meet him, and he's exactly as absurd as you'd expect. Private jets, a knighthood, $20 million in cash carried onto a cricket field in a clear plastic box. That part has been told 100 times. The part that hasn't is this. 4 separate times over 8 years, American regulators examined his business and concluded that what he was selling could not possibly be real. 4 separate times, that conclusion went up 1 floor and stopped moving. And not one of those 4 reports was buried by a bribe. Nobody in that office was paid off. That is what makes this so hard to sit with.
To understand why nobody moved, you have to understand what those examiners were actually looking at. Stay with me on this part, because the boring detail I'm about to give you is the exact thing that let one man walk off with $7 billion while 4 government reports sat in a drawer. And everything you're about to hear comes out of a 159-page federal investigation, sworn testimony in front of Congress, and a criminal docket. None of it is a theory. He wasn't selling stocks, he wasn't selling a hedge fund, he was selling certificates of deposit, CDs, the single most boring product in American finance. You hand a bank your money, you leave it alone for a couple of years, the bank hands it back with a little interest on top. Your grandmother owned CDs. That's the entire point of them. Nobody brags about a CD, nobody checks a CD every morning. You buy one precisely so you can stop thinking about it. And that is what made it the perfect thing to sell to a man who had just spent 40 years working shifts. Except these CDs weren't issued by a bank on Main Street. They were issued by a private bank on the island of Antigua, and that bank had exactly one owner, him. There was no board that could overrule him. There were no outside shareholders asking questions. The audits were signed off by a small local accounting firm. The regulator was the government of a country with fewer people in it than a mid-sized American suburb. The money went in, and what happened to it after that was known to 2 men. And the rate was the tell. In the middle of the 2000s, that bank was advertising CD returns around 7.5% at a time when American banks were paying 4 to 5. That's not a wild, obviously fake number. That's the dangerous kind of number. It's just high enough to make you feel clever for finding it, and just low enough that it doesn't sound like a scam. One financial analyst who finally sat down with the bank's own published documents said it took him a couple of hours to see the problem. Deposits had gone from $624 million in 1999 to more than $8 billion by the end of 2008. Nothing legitimate grows like that on a product that's supposed to be safe.
Now, before you decide who the villain of this story is, hold that thought, because by the end of this, the person who comes off worst might not be the man who ended up in handcuffs.
August 1997. A woman named Julie Pruitt had just been promoted to branch chief in the broker-dealer examination group of the Securities and Exchange Commission's Fort Worth office. Part of her new job was picking which firms in her region got examined, so she started reading through the registrants looking for anything that didn't fit. One Houston operation kept not fitting. The revenue flowing into the American brokerage arm was extraordinary, too extraordinary for its size, so she sent an experienced examiner down to Houston. In her own congressional testimony years later, she described what happened next in language that is almost painfully plain. In only a week, the examiner had collected enough evidence to suggest a fraudulent scheme, most likely a Ponzi scheme. The reasoning wasn't complicated. Enormous amounts of cash were being pumped into the American broker-dealer, and the source of that cash appeared to be investor money. The safety claims being made to customers didn't match what the operation was actually doing, and the returns promised on those CDs, plus the fat recurring referral fees paid to the salesman who sold them, could not both exist unless somebody was taking risks nobody had disclosed. The SEC's own internal tracking system recorded the conclusion of that 1997 examination in 6 words: possible misrepresentations, possible Ponzi scheme. Before the end of September, the examination group walked that finding down the hall to enforcement. That's how the machine is built. Examination finds the problem. Enforcement is the half with the subpoenas and the lawyers and the power to actually stop it. And enforcement, in Pruitt's words, met them with little enthusiasm.
Then something happened that I keep coming back to. In January of 1998, the woman who had been running that Fort Worth examination program retired. On her way out the door, she left her people a piece of advice. "Keep your eye on these people," she told them, "because this looks like a Ponzi scheme." That isn't a rumor someone remembered later. That line is in the federal investigation from a woman who had already given up trying to get anyone above her to care, and whose last official act was to make sure the warning outlived her own career.
In May 1998, enforcement finally opened a preliminary investigation, not because of the examiners, because a different agency happened to ask a question about the same company. 2 examiners got their shot at it. Within about 3 months, the head of enforcement in that office shut it down. And now watch the pattern, because the pattern is the whole story. 1998, another examination, same conclusion. 2002, another examination, same conclusion. 2004, another examination, same conclusion. 4 exams across 8 years, and according to the federal investigators who went back and reviewed all of them, the only meaningful difference between those reports was the size of the number in them. In 1997, it was $250 million. By the 2004 exam, it was around $1.5 billion. The fraud was growing in front of them, in writing, in their own filing system, and every time the file went upstairs, it died there.
Keep those 4 reports in your head, by the way. Every one of them comes back before this is over, and not one of them stops anything.
And it wasn't only coming from inside the building. In late 2000, a broker named Layla Weidler went to work for the company as a financial advisor. She looked at the CD, she asked her own bosses for an honest appraisal of what the Antiguan bank actually held, and she didn't get one. So she refused to sell it to her clients. She would later testify in front of the Senate that at that firm, advisors who sold the CD were praised and compensated, and advisors who didn't were terminated. In 2002, she was terminated. In 2003, she wrote to the SEC, and she didn't hedge a word of it. She said the firm was a lingering corporate fraud scandal, being run as a massive Ponzi scheme that would destroy the life savings of many, damage the reputation of everyone associated with it, ridicule the securities and banking authorities, and shame the United States of America. She sent versions of that letter to the industry's own regulator and to 2 of the largest newspapers in the country. In 2004, she went back to the SEC again, this time without hiding her name, sat down with officials in that same Fort Worth office and handed over her emails. 6 years later, the fraud she had described collapsed in almost exactly the way she said it would.
So here's the question the federal investigators eventually had to answer. You have 4 examinations reaching the same conclusion. You have a fired insider spelling it out in writing and mailing it to 3 separate institutions. You have a retiring supervisor telling her staff to watch these people. Why did nothing happen? The answer is the most uncomfortable fact in this entire story, and it has nothing to do with Antigua.
They were being graded on volume.
According to the Inspector General's investigation, senior people in that Fort Worth office believed they were judged by headquarters on their stats, the number of cases filed, not the size of the fraud stopped, not the dollars saved, not the retirements protected, the count. And when the metric is the count, a complicated offshore case involving a foreign bank, a bought foreign regulator, and years of forensic accounting is the single worst use of your time available. It might take 4 years and produce exactly 1 case. Meanwhile, the attorney at the next desk closes 6 small, clean, obvious matters in the same stretch and looks 3 times as productive on paper. So novel or complex cases were disfavored. That's the phrase in the report. Disfavored. Not forbidden, not covered up, just quietly, permanently not worth doing. The investigation found that the head of enforcement in that office turned down requests to investigate this company no fewer than 6 times between 1998 and 2005. 6. And when Pruitt later asked him directly why he'd never opened a real case back in the 90s, his answer, as she recounted it to investigators, was that he had asked someone at the firm about the allegations and been told there was nothing to them. He was satisfied with that and decided not to pursue it further. That is the entire defense of 12 years. He asked them, and they said no. There's one more piece to this, and I want to be precise about it, because precision matters here. That same enforcement chief left the SEC in 2005 and went into private practice, and afterward he tried to represent the company he had repeatedly declined to investigate. In January 2012, he agreed to pay a $50,000 fine to settle a Justice Department claim that he had improperly represented his former agency's subject. He did not admit the allegations. He paid, and the matter was closed. $50,000. Most of the people in this story who did nothing wrong lost more than that in a single afternoon.
And this is where it stops being a story about money. Because while 4 American reports were quietly going nowhere, the man they were about was buying the one thing that would make those reports impossible to act on. He was buying the regulator. Antigua is a small country, and he made himself enormous inside it. He was the largest private employer on the island. He owned the local bank, the local newspaper, a stake in an airline. He built a cricket ground. He landed a helicopter at Lord's, the most sacred cricket ground in England, and climbed out with $20 million in a clear case to announce a single winner-take-all match. Antigua made him a knight. For years, the newspapers called him Sir Alan. And the man responsible for regulating his bank, the administrator and chief executive of Antigua's Financial Services Regulatory Commission, a dual American and Antiguan citizen named Leroy King, was on his payroll.
We know the amounts because King eventually admitted them under oath in an American courtroom. Cash payments totaling approximately $520,000, 963 cents and 87 cents. Tickets to 2 Super Bowls, one in Houston, one in Detroit. Repeated flights on private jets. And here's what that money actually bought. When the SEC finally started sending Antigua official questions about what was really inside that bank's portfolio, King made sure the answers came back clean. And according to the indictment, he did something worse than that. He took the SEC's confidential inquiries and handed them to the man being investigated, so the answers could be shaped before they were ever sent. Think about what that does to the examiners back in Fort Worth. Every time somebody in Washington said, well, the bank is regulated by Antigua, and Antigua says it's fine, they were quoting a man who had already been paid.
Now let me tell you what all of this looked like from the other end. Not from a federal office in Fort Worth, from a kitchen table in Louisiana. There was a refinery worker named Troy Lilly. He spent nearly 40 years at ExxonMobil in Baton Rouge and retired in 2005. He told the United States Senate, in writing, that he was in no way knowledgeable about how to invest his retirement funds. So 5 years before he retired, he and his wife Melanie started doing exactly what careful people do. They talked to advisors at several different firms, they went to seminars, they asked around. And everyone around them kept saying the same name, because in Baton Rouge, that company was everywhere. It sponsored local sporting events. It sponsored segments of the local news. It had a suite of offices on the 8th floor of a prominent downtown building. And the advisors weren't strangers flown in from New York. They were neighbors. They were people from church. Lilly testified that almost every victim he later spoke with said the same thing, that their advisor had made a point of mentioning prayer and faith as a major part of his life. That was the real product, not the yield, the familiarity. The Lillys started with $50,000 in 2004, money they had saved toward a retirement home, money that had been sitting in a plain certificate of deposit at their local credit union, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Over the next few years, they moved everything, $954,000, all of it. In December 2008, with the financial crisis tearing through everything, their advisor called and told them to redeem the CDs and get out. They said yes immediately.
The money never came. On February 17, 2009, a federal judge froze the entire operation and handed it to a receiver. Across Louisiana, retired refinery workers, teachers, plant supervisors, people who had done the responsible thing, who had asked around, who had deliberately chosen the boring, safe product, found out from the evening news. One woman who had opened a retirement account there after 28 years of teaching high school math said the first thing she felt was that she had been very, very dumb. She wasn't dumb. 4 federal examinations had already agreed with her instincts, and every one of them had been overruled inside her own government. But here's the part almost nobody knows. Julie Pruitt, the examiner who started all of this in 1997 and pushed after every single one of those 4 exams, did not get a promotion out of it. Around 2007, her office rolled out a new initiative pushing examiners toward faster, lighter, higher volume examinations. She objected. She said, in effect, that quick surface-level exams would pull people away from the deep work that actually finds fraud, which, given what she had spent the previous decade watching, was not an abstract opinion. She was called into meetings and admonished for opposing it. She was issued a letter of reprimand. She was involuntarily transferred out of her supervisory role. In 2008, she was reassigned to report to a regional director who, in her words to Congress, would at times go weeks or even months intentionally avoiding any contact with her. A colleague who complained to headquarters about how she was being treated received a performance counseling memo for his trouble.
And when the Inspector General reviewed all of it, he concluded that technically, legally, she did not qualify as a whistleblower because she had raised her concerns inside her own chain of command instead of going outside it. She did the job correctly through the proper channels for more than 10 years, and the system's answer was that doing it correctly didn't count.
The end came fast, and it came from the wrong direction entirely. In December 2008, Bernard Madoff confessed, and the SEC's failure to catch him became a national humiliation. Suddenly, complex offshore fraud was the most important thing in the building. Suddenly, the Fort Worth file mattered. At the same time, the crisis was doing to this scheme what crises always do to Ponzi schemes. Everyone wanted their money back at once. The bank put a freeze on early redemptions. At an all-hands meeting, employees were told the bank was sitting on $5 billion in excess liquidity. According to court records, while that sentence was being said out loud, his own controller was sending frantic messages putting the real figure at about $173 million. February 2009, the SEC sued and a receiver took the doors. June 2009, a federal grand jury returned a 21-count indictment. March 2012, a Houston jury convicted him on 13 felony counts. June 2012, 110 years in federal prison, plus a personal money judgment of $5.9 billion that will never be paid. 5 other people were convicted, with sentences running from 3 to 20 years. The Antiguan regulator fought extradition for a decade, was finally brought to the United States in November 2019, pleaded guilty, and was sentenced in February 2021 to 10 years.
That's justice, technically. Here's what it was worth. Roughly 18,000 investors lost something like $5 billion in real money. As of late 2018, after nearly 10 years of receivership work, about $500 million had been recovered, and courts had approved roughly $224 million of that for the receiver's own fees and expenses, which left the victims about 5 cents on the dollar. Later settlements with banks and insurers pushed the total recovered past $1 billion, then past $2.5 billion, and money is still being clawed back today. But nobody in this story gets made whole, and a great many of the people who were 65 years old in 2009 are not here to collect. Troy Lilly, who had worked a refinery for almost 40 years specifically so he could retire early, went back to work. He took a job as a clerk on an oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico, 2 weeks at a stretch, in failing health, leaving his wife at home alone. And then, in April 2010, the government published the file on itself. A 159-page report from the SEC's own Inspector General, requested by 2 senators, laying out every examination, every referral, every refusal by date. It's public. You can download it in about 10 seconds. And what makes it so hard to read isn't what it accuses anyone of. It's what it doesn't. Nobody in Fort Worth was bribed. Nobody was blackmailed. Everybody was just busy with something that counted more.
So let's go back to the question we started with. How does a warning sit inside a government for 12 years while the number behind it grows 28 times bigger? It doesn't take a conspiracy. It takes a scoreboard. Somebody, somewhere, decided that the way to measure a fraud investigator was to count how many cases he filed this year. That single decision made the hardest cases the least rewarding ones to touch. And the hardest case sitting in that office happened to be the second largest Ponzi scheme in American history. Here's the part that stays with me. Every piece of the system that was supposed to detect this actually worked. The examiner found it in 7 days. The insider wrote it down and mailed it to 3 institutions. The retiring supervisor handed the warning to her staff on her last day. Detection wasn't the failure. Detection was flawless. What failed was the part where somebody had to be willing to spend 4 years on a case that would only ever count as 1. So the next time you hear that a regulator missed something, ask a different question than everyone else is asking. Don't ask whether they knew. They usually knew. Ask what that agency was counting that year, and what it wasn't.
I want to hear from you on this one. If you had been Julie Pruitt in 2004, with 4 reports written and 4 reports ignored, and your own career sitting in your hands, would you have gone outside the agency and blown it up in public? Or would you have kept filing the reports and trusting the system to eventually work? There is a real cost to both of those answers. Tell me in the comments which one you'd have picked. And if you want more stories like this one, the one sitting in public records that nobody ever bothered to read, subscribe
and I'll keep pulling them out of the file.